Hello. My name is Thobani K on another podcast episode from APORDE. As you may know, APORDE is African Program on Rethinking Development Economics, and today I am with Fiona Tregenna.
Hi, Thobani, and greetings to your listeners. It's really a pleasure to be doing this podcast today.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be in your presence today. Before we proceed, I would just like to request that you maybe introduce yourself to our listeners.
Okay. Well, my name is Fiona Tregenna. In my day job, I am based at the University of Johannesburg, where I run a center, the South African Research Chair in Industrial Development, which does research, training, capacity building, public and policy engagement, mainly in the field of industrial development and related issues like industrial policy, trade, regional integration, innovation, technological upgrading, and so on. And I'm also a professor of economics at the University of Johannesburg. Beyond that, I'm involved in various policy processes at the international, continental, regional, national, subnational levels. And in relation to APORDE, I'm currently chairing the scientific committee of APORDE and been involved with APORDE for many years, also lecturing in APORDE.
Oh, wonderful. So if you've been involved with APORDE for many years, I can assume you have a deep understanding in terms of its progress. So my first question to you is, how has APORDE evolved and what do you see as its importance and significance in today's climate?
Yeah, APORDE is a really critical initiative, and it's incredible that next year APORDE will be celebrating 20 years. During those 2 decades, there are so many participants who've passed through the program, and hopefully it's benefited them. They've gone on to greater heights in their careers. Obviously, all of them came already from a strong educational and professional background, but there's been such fantastic feedback over the years in terms of how APORDE has deepened their understanding of economic development in Africa. And yeah, I think the exposure to the lectures, APORDE brings out some of the leading thinkers in the field of economic development. And for many participants, even if they've got multiple degrees in economics or related issues, because of the way the curriculum is often structured, they might not even have covered some of the critical issues relevant to economic development in Africa, for example, around political economy. And APORDE gives that opportunity for exposure to various perspectives, various issues, ranging from poverty, aid, trade, green transition, industrialization, conflict, and so on, or some of the topics covered in APORDE over the years. We also have an allied program, Industrial Policy for Policymakers, IPPM, which runs alongside APORDE for the first week. The IPPM is focused specifically on policymakers from across Africa. For them, it's a really great opportunity to kind of take a step back from their day jobs and not only refresh, but immerse themselves in perspectives that hopefully will assist them and support them in their work. If I look back at the history of APORDE, it actually has its origins in the CAPORDE program, Cambridge Advanced Program on Rethinking Development Economics, which was initiated by Hajun Chang and ran in Cambridge for several years. I actually attended one of the early editions of CAPORDE myself as a participant, and then was invited back the next year to help Hajun in running it. And from the CAPORDE program, there was one spin-off program in Latin America, LAPORDE, and then APORDE. And APORDE is definitely the longest running of the programs. Part of that is the generous funding support that has been provided by the DTIC, without which APORDE would not have been able to continue running for all this period. And I think it's testimony to the commitment of the DTIC to development, not only in South Africa, but across the continent, that the DTIC has generously provided this sustained funding for 2 decades, which has enabled hundreds of participants to pass through APORDE. one of the ways in which we are trying to strengthen the kind of ongoing links and networks of the APORDE alumni is the alumni network that has been building over the last couple of years. So I think when people are here for 2 weeks in a residential program, they form often really close ties. Looking back at myself, even as I said, one of the early participants in CAPORDE, now a couple of decades ago, I'm still in touch professionally and personally with some of the fellow participants that I was with there. So we find here that often people want to keep in touch, and those networks can benefit them even professionally, exchange of information. Sometimes they can collaborate on research, on grant proposals, hear about job opportunities, and so on. So there is now a APORDE alumni network, and also there's a APORDE alumni conference. It's now an annual fixture, which gives former participants an opportunity to share some of their research and network with other participants, not only from their year, but also from other cohorts as well. And that's something that we're keen to expand in the future. Maybe just coming back to some of the importance of APORDE, it really offers like a range of pluralistic perspectives that are often not provided in formal economics training or associated training programs in universities. And I think a part of that offering is to ensure to give participants exposure to heterodox perspectives. Across the continent, most of the educational institutions are almost exclusively focused on mainstream economics training. And while many of those tools are, of course, important, but there's really a dearth of exposure to heterodox perspectives that bring in issues of power, that bring in different methodological approaches, and in many cases also just bring in an innate commitment to the development of the continent. The lecturers in APORDE themselves come from different perspectives. And I think that's really important. It's not about pushing one specific angle or one specific view on African development, because it's complex and nuanced, and there's richness and value in the range of perspectives. So it's not about pushing one narrow perspective, but more about exposing participants to different views that can only enrich their own understanding of African economic development. And I think for participants, it's part of a process where in any person's intellectual and professional development, you bring in your educational background, your professional experiences, all of the learnings from that informing your own views.
Wonderful. Sounds like it's also about building community, as you speak about networks that you've kept for so many years. To your view, why is industrial development relevant in today's world?
Yeah, I'm of the view that industrial development is critical for growth, development, and for catching up. When we look at the industrialization process in developing countries, it's really the key pathway to sustained, rapid growth. Even if we look historically around the world, it's very rare that a country would be able to achieve sustained high rates of growth without industrializing at some point. When we look at the African continent, it's a region which has largely failed to industrialize. Of course, there are success stories of industrialization, both historically and in the current period. But as a continent, the levels of industrialization on average have remained low. There was early successive industrialization in the post-independence periods, but in many countries, those were halted and reversed by structural adjustment programs that led to premature de-industrialization, or even what I've called pre-industrial de-industrialization. So countries kind of started to de-industrialize before they'd even industrialized in any kind of full or meaningful sense. And of course, the limitations of economic development in Africa are multifaceted, and it would be simplistic to attribute it to any one or narrow set of factors. There's issues of political economy, the international economic order, conflict, and so on. But I think that the failures of industrialization are certainly part of the story. And it's not just about growth, but it's about more broadly, developing capabilities, transforming societies, wider economic and social development. So I think that industrialization remains important. Manufacturing sector remains important. Of course, it's not all that matters. And each sector is really heterogeneous. If we look at the services sector, for example, there's such a wide range of activities within services. Some of them high productivity, high skills, tradable activities. Similarly, not all manufacturing activities necessarily have those characteristics. In my opinion, there are still important common denominators to each sector that give industrialization a particular importance, but it's also important just to look at what is the kinds of activities and promote kind of productive growth-pulling sectors across the economy. Industrialization is not something that necessarily just unfolds automatically by itself. And this brings us to the importance of industrial policy, of the role of the state in supporting industrialization, upgrading, and helps firms to take advantage of the opportunities that are there. So I think industrialization and industrial policy are as important as they've ever been for growth and development in Africa.
I can't help myself but ask this question. If people are attracted to come here at APORDE, and APORDE is offering heterodox economics, can we assume that heterodox economics do not exist in the state? And perhaps why is that so? If we are teaching people mainstream economics in, formal mainstream educational institutions, I'm just saying, is that an easy conclusion to make, to say, okay, government does not look at heterodox economics in running the state? And what would that mean?
It's a little bit of an awkward framing, because it's not that the government has to look at heterodox economics per se. And of course, governments are diverse. If we're talking about across the continent, the policies are very mixed, not only in terms of industrial policy, but more broadly. Yeah, it's a little bit of an awkward question. I'm not sure how to answer it. Let me maybe turn it around to say, I think part of the importance of programs such as APORDE and the IPPM are exposing policymakers to diverse perspectives, including heterodox perspectives. But there's no one-size-fits-all or kind of copy and paste blueprint. It's about learning from their experiences, not only historically from the East Asian tigers, but even if we look currently, what is Ethiopia doing, what's happening in Mauritius, and so on. Not just to copy and paste that to other contexts, but also different countries don't have to reinvent the wheel, as if there's not long periods of learning that can happen, not only from the successes, but also from the failures.
I see. My last question, how important is it to have capacity in government on industrial policy?
Capacity and capability of the state is absolutely fundamental, not only to industrial policy, but to economic policy more broadly and to growth and development outcomes. Without state capabilities, even if there are good policies on paper, but if there's not the ability to implement them effectively, it would be very difficult to have a transformative socio-economic development and improved outcomes. So a program such as APORDE and also the IPPM have really important roles to play in terms of building up that capacity and those capabilities in governments across the continent. Obviously, it's a fairly limited intervention if we think about how many thousands of people are employed in economic policy roles across governments and the limited number of people that can be exposed to a program such as this. So it's a limited intervention. It can't solve all of the problems, but it does make some sort of contribution. I think there are other ways as well that countries can build up those capabilities. For example, historically, if we look at East Asian countries in their early stages of industrialization, they would send their policymakers to other countries that were at more advanced stages of industrial policy implementation to learn from those. I always think that perhaps the best way of building state capacity and capabilities is actually through the implementation of policy. So it's kind of a learning by doing in policy making. Industrial policy is not something which you can just learn from books or even from short training programs such as APORDE and IPPM, as important as they are. It's really only through the implementation of industrial policy that those capabilities can be built. So it's by designing and implementing policies, some of which will hopefully have the desired outcomes, but some of them won't. And that goes across the world. The key thing is being able to learn from those failures and build those into the future design of and implementation of policies. So I think we should avoid something where countries feel, okay, we're not yet ready to implement industrial policy. We need to kind of build our capacity first, and then we can get into that. And this is something which sometimes there's a pushback against industrial policy. Oh, it's too complex. It's too difficult for African governments to do. They should kind of back off from that or build some capacity first and then try and implement. That's not how industrial policy works. You need to actually design and implement industrial policy in order to build that capacity to do so. So it's a learning by doing in the implementation of industrial policy. Of course, I'm not suggesting just kind of recklessly designing inappropriate policies and wasting public money when there's so many priorities. But it's just about getting on with it as well. So, for example, in the field of macroeconomic policy, nobody says, oh, you can't do macroeconomic policy because it's too complex. You need to build capacity first. Like every country of the world, the government is expected to implement macroeconomic policy. But macroeconomic policy is also pretty complex. But they kind of have to get on with it. So I think even in terms of industrial policy, governments need to steam ahead with designing and implementing industrial policy, of course, in an iterative process with firms and so on, and involving the various layers of government, both vertically and horizontally. I think that programs such as APORDE and the IPPM do have an important role to play in building that capacity, as do a whole range of other interventions. The educational systems of those countries, exchange programs for policymakers, ongoing training on the job, and so on.
All right. Thank you, Fiona. That's all the time we had for today.
Thanks, Thobani, and bye to you and the listeners.